As we continue to talk about the labor market, now let's look at some unemployment trends. So we'll look at some graphs and see what those graphs are telling us with respect to unemployment over time. First of all, this is a graphic that shows unemployment levels from 1960 through 2015. Obviously, it truncates here at about 2013 or 14, where we have the most recent data. And we're looking at unemployment rates of anywhere from 3% to maybe as much as 11%. So these would be the formal unemployment statistics that would be provided to us by, say, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we see that in these blue or grayish bands, which represent recessions, we see that unemployment is very low as we come into a recession, and that unemployment rises during a recession. Well, that doesn't surprise us. That's exactly what the cyclical unemployment figures, the business cycle unemployment relationship would cause it to look like. We come out of a recession with a high level of unemployment, but then during economic expansion, unemployment falls and hits some kind of a trough. As the employment markets have heated up, as the business markets have heated up, and as GDP has risen, and then we maybe see that there is some factor that causes us to enter a recession. Now, it's interesting as we think about these things. You might suppose then that high levels of unemployment, or rather low levels of unemployment, would be a good indicator of a recession coming, or a high level of unemployment would be a good indicator of the end of a recession. And unfortunately, these aren't necessarily true. We don't know how long these low levels of employment will last. We don't know how long the high level of employment will last. And so it's not as accurate a predictor as you might hope it to be as you see these obvious peaks and valleys, these troughs and such. But clearly, what we've seen over time is that unemployment levels are non-constant. They have tended to rise slightly over time. If we tried to put a trend line to this graph, I think we would see it rising slightly, but such that we see that our troughs are higher and our peaks are higher. But that's not always been true. We have then saw that our troughs got much lower as we came into the late 90s, but then our peaks were lower as well. And then we hit the Great Recession. We went from a relatively low trough to a relatively high peak. So unemployment over time has tended to lead a recession, and then lower levels or high levels of unemployment tend to be the results of a recession. We see that recessions have taken place a little bit more consistently or rapidly in the early decades, and maybe less so in the latter decades. But now let's take a look at these and start to break out these rates and see what they might mean to different groups within our economy and society. First, let's think of the real unemployment rate. We said in the prior segment that there were a number of types of workers whose unemployment or underemployment or lesser employment were not captured by the official unemployment figures that we might see in this graphic. So let's think about the real unemployment rate as we may be able to bring these discouraged workers, these underemployed workers, maybe these self-employed workers with lesser incomes during recessions and contractions into the mix. Well, if you come back to the prior graphic, we see that really we're moving from something in the low range of about 3.5% to the high range of just under 11% in unemployment rates. A very different picture when we look at the real unemployment market. This is looking now from about the year 2000 to the end of 2013, so it's a much shorter time period. But in that time period, we see that unemployment on a real basis was at about 9% at the low and upwards of 19% at the high. So a good 10% more than the same figures on an official basis. And so this is going to take into account the discouraged worker, the increase in disabled workers, the underemployed, the self-employed. As we look at this differently now by by not only a little bit of looking at it from gender standpoint and age band standpoint, but also from race and ethnicity standpoint. Where we see, in this case, unemployment figures January of 2012 and then separately January of 2013 in the lavender and purple bars respectively, we see that overall unemployment was 8.3 to 7.9% in those 2 years. For males, it was a little bit less. For females, it was a little bit less, which is a little bit interesting to us because if the total is males and females, how each of those two groups could be a little bit less becomes kind of interesting. But then we have to start to think about, okay, this is for adults 20 and over. If we bring into this the teenage population, 16 to 19 years of age, then those numbers are dramatically higher. They're virtually identical for both years, 23.4% for each year. This would suggest to us that unemployment was significant for teenagers, less so for adults, and we know that that's largely because teenagers are going to have a lesser skill set and going to be less dependent upon jobs. Employers are perhaps less likely to employ a teenager versus a more highly skilled older adult in their 20s, 30s, etc. And so in these 2 years, we saw those that difference certainly manifest itself. We look at the white population now compared to blacks or Hispanics, and we see that the white population's values are slightly lower than the average for males and females, or the total overall. This would be perhaps a function of a couple of things. We see clearly that the black and African American population were unemployed at a much higher rate, 13.6, 13.8%. Even Hispanics were unemployed at a higher rate, 10.5 and 9.7%. Well, this may have something to do with a couple of factors. To begin with, we have to admit that at this point in our society, and no matter how enlightened we hope that we are, there is still some discrimination that exists in society. And that when times are tough economically, that discrimination maybe rises to the surface a little bit more readily. So that might be part of what we're seeing in these differences. But we also have to accept that there's two other elements that clearly are going to be involved here, maybe even three. And one of them is going to be education levels. We know that that minority populations in the U.S. society tend to participate in higher education at a lesser rate than non-minorities do. Well, if education yields better preparation and more productivity, this would then lead us to believe that these populations suffered from some of the same problems of unemployment as we see the teenagers suffer, as the teenagers are perceived to be less productive, less skilled, and so these populations might be perceived the same way for the same reason, less access to good productive education. Perhaps part of what we're seeing here is then regional issues. We see that within our cities that we have more minority populations represented, higher concentration of ethnicity within the cities, and maybe the jobs in the cities were more brittle in this period of time than jobs generally across the country. And we would believe that because we know that we've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs. And this maybe then also has to do with the kind of jobs that some of these workers are pursuing, in part because of their regionality, in part because of their education. And so these are going to lead to higher levels of unemployment amongst them. And then finally, we have to think about the health of these populations. We know that the minority populations tend to be A, lower income, B, have less education, and that then in most metrics leads to C, that they have a lower levels of health. This clearly is part of what the Affordable Care Act is seeking to equalize. Whether it is successful or not is another issue, but we see that these populations are simply more brittle. Maybe their health is less, and so their ability to be productive is less, in which the level of health is positively correlated with levels of income and levels of education. Let's think about this in terms of the amount of education now. We see that the highest rates of unemployment from 1992 through to 2013 or so here, the highest levels of unemployment are experienced by the less educated, less productive, less prepared in our society. Those without a high school diploma clearly have the highest levels of unemployment in any period of time. It's interesting that these lines and these trends never cross one another. That tells us how robust and how statistically significant they probably are. High school graduates, so higher skill sets, better able to read, better able to cooperate, more access to technology, and the ability to understand it. They are unemployed at lower rates than those with less education, and then finally those with college education. College graduates at any level, associates all the way through the doctoral levels, are going to experience the least levels of unemployment. It's interesting as we think about this. This has to do with human capital, and I would ask the question, does it pay to invest in your human capital? And human capital is going to have three inputs: education, health, and migration. And investments in any one of these three inputs to human capital are thought to improve the near and long-term income capacity of human beings as a part of the production process. And so we look at this and we can see that clearly on the education standpoint that that's the case, whereas this may not be telling us much about actual levels of income, but this may be telling us about how reliable one's ability to have income is through the employment rates. And the more well-educated worker is the one that's less likely to be subject to unemployment. Their income is less brittle, and we also know that in fact their income is higher. So as we look a little further through unemployment over time, now differentiating males and females, we're looking here at July of 2008 through 2009. So this is simply 1 year during the recession that we've just experienced. What accounts for these differences? Well, a number of things account for them, of course. I don't think what we're really seeing here is any discrimination against males and preference for females during this year necessarily, but we clearly are seeing that men are unemployed at a higher rate in this period, going from just over 6% officially to approximately 10.5%, versus females at just over 5% to officially right about 8%. So females didn't suffer as badly as males in the recent recession. Some of this is going to have to do with wage levels. If men happen to make more for any given job in the U.S. economy than a female, which sadly is still sometimes the case, and a firm is scrapping or scraping to get by, and they need to let somebody go, they're going to perhaps let go the person with the highest expense, and so that might have been the male. More commonly, I think, and we'll see this in another slide in a moment, more commonly I think what we're looking at here is the fact that male-dominated jobs were hit more severely in the recession than female-dominated jobs. Well, let's look now at some of the unemployment trends by race and ethnicity. This is not a lot different than what we saw a few minutes ago, but it is some, of course. And we see that Black and Hispanic unemployment figures from 1975 through 2010 are consistently higher than white unemployment figures. Some of this may be discrimination, some of it may be health, some of it may be job preferences, regionality, choice of location, and some of it is simply the preparation based upon access to education and assimilation of education and such. Here's an interesting item. We began to measure in this graphic Asian populations in the year 2000, and we see that they tend to have, at 2000, a similar rate of unemployment as whites. That tends to cross back and forth a little bit with whites, and this is interesting because it's the only set of lines that cross here. We don't see blacks or Hispanics. We don't see those lines crossing each other, or certainly crossing or approaching the white population's unemployment figures, but for a period here we saw that Asian unemployment was yet higher than white unemployment, and in other periods lower than. This is probably a function of the high-tech industry, which tends to be have a greater concentration of Asian Americans in it than other industries. This might also be because of self-employment, where we see that Asian Americans tend to be self-employed at a higher rate than these other three ethnic groups. So what accounts for these? Skills differentiation, and then occupational preferences and possibly some discrimination. Finally, if we look now at different jobs, there's different occupations, starting in 2008 and ending at about 2013, and normalized, so they all have the same starting point at 100. We see which occupations reduced in their payrolls and increased their payrolls during the recession. These aren't exactly unemployment rates. These are payroll levels, and I think that increasing in payroll levels or decreasing in payroll levels would have some positive correlation with unemployment rates. If a payroll is increasing, then unemployment in that sector is probably constant or decreasing, and vice versa. Well, I don't think it's any secret to any of us that since the recent financial crisis and recession was led by the housing market, the construction workers, which are male-dominated, then took a very big hit very quickly, and as of the end of 2012 had not recovered. We see some improvements in this in 2013 and 14 as the housing market has regained some of its footing, and some areas even heated up. We see that education and health workers, which are predominantly female-oriented or concentrated in the domestic society, we see that those workers didn't have a real problem here. Their payrolls continue to rise. We can then believe that their unemployment experiences were not exaggerated. Similarly with government, it's interesting, we saw in the early stages of the recession, we saw the leisure industry, so discretionary expenditures, sometimes even for luxury goods, fell, but then as the economy began to stabilize and strengthen, then began to rise. Professional services have had the same experience. It's interesting here, the one that gives the most divergent pattern to all the others is the mining and logging industry. This would include the oil and gas industry, coal industry, which we clearly, as the economy was softening, we saw households and businesses using less energy, and so we see a decline here in employment in that, in payrolls in that industry. But then as technologies began to find less expensive ways to bring those resources out of the ground, as we began to find better ways to efficiently process those commodities such that the end energy product could be less expensive, we saw dramatic increases here, and I don't think this is a surprise to any of us. Manufacturing came off rather dramatically and has stayed relatively low, although clearly seen some improvement within the 2010-2012 time periods. What might be interesting also then is to think about where do these trend lines head after time. And what does it tell us? So here we're looking at some percent job losses over a period of years, and we can see the different colored lines are now different recessions. The bright red line here being the most recent recession, whereas each different color has a different time period of recession to it. And one of the things we're seeing here is that this recession, in terms of unemployment or job losses, this most recent recession was not only very deep, but has been very prolonged. Some of these others, say the 1948 recession, was relatively deep, but it was relatively short. We're looking here at the number of months after the peak of employment. If you think about a high employment or low unemployment being an indicator of recession. So as we look here, we see that most of these recessions were sharp and short. The recession that's identified here, which I believe this is 1960, was neither sharp nor necessarily short, but it also wasn't as long as this one. We see the most recent one, even at the 58-month mark, still being well under what our previous unemployment rates were. This is probably the end of 2012, I would believe. And so we saw that recession in 2001 was long, but not nearly as deep. The recession in 1960 was not as long and not as deep. And so where do these lines taking us? Well, this line, the 2007 recession, as of the formation of this graphic, still hasn't reached back to its employment levels. So when might we be able to see that? Well, we think we can see it if we just take a look at some trend lines. We think we would see this as of April of 2015, which this is being recorded in February of 2015, so it's just a few months from now. we saw that at the end of 2014 that the national unemployment rate was about 5.6%. Here, this clearly would then would suggest that we're at or near that at this point in time.